The mountain man hadn't touched a woman in 15 years, until a black mail-order bride arrived by mistake, her trembling voice calling hello, as his axe froze mid-swing above the chopping block. The townsfolk below whispered he was cursed, a broken hermit who'd die alone on his peak, too mad for civilized company. They assumed his fate was sealed in ice and silence. Meanwhile, the educated woman from the east clutched a marriage contract bearing his name, believing she'd found salvation from her own desperate flight. But she carried secrets that could destroy them both: his buried guilt over a deadly accident, her false accusations of theft that forced this journey. The racist townspeople would react with violence if they discovered a black woman alone with the wild man of the mountains. When two souls running from their past collide by fate's mistake, will their meeting heal old wounds or ignite a fire that consumes them both? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The axe split through pine with a satisfying crack. Thatcher Kane wiped sweat from his brow despite the March cold biting at his exposed forearms. 15 years of this routine. 15 years of silence broken only by the wind through the Utah peaks and the steady rhythm of his work. He had been different once. Professor Thatcher Kane, they called him then. Before the accident, before the wagon wheel caught that rocky outcrop on the mountain pass. Before his pregnant wife Sarah died in his arms while he bled helplessly into the snow. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge below still whispered about him. The educated man who went mad with grief. The hermit who spoke to ghosts. They crossed themselves when his name came up, convinced he was cursed or dangerous or both. Sheriff Clayton made sure the stories stayed dark. Better to have folks fear the mountain than venture up to discover Thatcher was just a broken man who preferred books to people. Clayton had his reasons for keeping visitors away from the high country. Thatcher split another log. The repetitive motion calmed his mind the way teaching once had. Mathematics, literature, law, all useless now in his world of wood and stone and endless quiet. The sound of wagon wheels on the rocky trail made him freeze. Nobody came up here, ever. A battered stagecoach rounded the bend, the driver looking nervous as he guided his horses toward the cabin. Thatcher dropped his axe and stepped back into the shadows of the barn. His heart hammered against his ribs. The coach door opened. A woman stepped down. Thatcher's breath caught. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool, her dark skin smooth despite the long journey. Everything about her spoke of education and refinement. She clutched a leather satchel and what looked like official papers. She was the most beautiful thing he had seen in 15 years. The driver tossed down a trunk and climbed back onto his seat. "This is as far as I go, miss. T. Kane's place, just like you asked." Thatcher pressed himself further into the shadows. T. Kane, Thomas Kane, the shopkeeper in town who ordered supplies through the territorial mail service. The man had the same last name, nothing more. The woman smoothed her skirts and approached the cabin door. She knocked with confidence that made Thatcher's chest tighten. When had anyone last knocked on his door? "Hello, Mr. Kane?" Her voice carried the crisp consonants of Boston education. Thatcher's jaw worked silently. He had not spoken to another human being in over 2 years. "Mr. Thomas Kane? I'm Eliza Mayfield, your bride." The words hit Thatcher like a physical blow. Mail-order bride. For Thomas Kane. The cruel shopkeeper who treated everyone beneath him like dirt. Especially people who looked like this woman. She knocked again, harder this time. "I know you're here. I can see the smoke from your chimney." Thatcher's hands shook as he stepped from the shadows. She turned at the sound of his boots on the packed earth. Her eyes widened, but she did not retreat. "You're not Thomas Kane." He tried to speak. Nothing came out but a rough croak. She studied his face with intelligent eyes, took in his worn leather clothes, his untrimmed beard, the calluses on his hands, but also the neat cabin behind him, the well-maintained tools, the careful stack of split wood. "You can read." She nodded toward the book he had left open on the porch rail. "Marcus Aurelius, in Latin." Thatcher found his voice. You're in the wrong place. The driver said, T. Kane. Thomas Kane lives in town. I'm Thatcher. She pulled out a contract and read it carefully, her brow furrowed. The correspondence definitely said T. Kane, Mountain Property, Cedar Ridge Territory. Mistake. A rather expensive mistake. She looked back at the empty road where the stagecoach had disappeared. I spent my last dollar getting here. Dark clouds gathered over the peaks. Thatcher recognized the signs. Heavy snow within the hour, enough to block the mountain passes for days. Storm coming. You need to get to town. How far? 5 miles down. Too far to walk in what's coming. She studied the threatening sky. Then I suppose I'm staying here tonight. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse. He could not handle human company, could not bear conversation or questions, or the simple presence of another breathing soul in his carefully controlled world. But the alternative was watching her freeze to death on the mountain road. One night, he managed. She smiled for the first time since stepping down from the coach. The expression transformed her entire face, revealing warmth that made Thatcher's forgotten heart stir painfully in his chest. Thank you, Mr. Thatcher Kane. She lifted her trunk and walked toward his cabin door, as if she belonged there, as if fate had not just delivered the wrong woman to a man who had given up on living. The first snowflakes began to fall as she disappeared inside his sanctuary. Thatcher stood frozen in his yard, watching his breath cloud in the suddenly frigid air. 15 years of silence, shattered by a stranger's smile. The storm was going to be worse than he thought. The blizzard hit with mountain fury. Snow pounded the cabin windows in sheets of white that turned day to twilight. Thatcher sat rigid in his chair by the fire, hyper-aware of every sound Eliza made as she explored his sanctuary. She ran her fingers along his bookshelf with obvious hunger. Philosophy, literature, legal texts, mathematics, the collection of a scholar, not a hermit. You taught school, not a question. Once. What happened? Thatcher stared into the flames. Life. She did not press. Instead, she pulled a slim volume of poetry from the shelf and settled into Sarah's old chair. The sight of another person in that spot sent ice through his veins. By morning, 3 feet of snow blocked the door. Thatcher forced it open and stepped into a world transformed. The storm had been worse than even he expected. The road down the mountain had vanished completely. How long? Eliza asked from behind him. 3 days, maybe 4. She absorbed this news without complaint. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves and helped him dig a path to the barn. Her hands, soft from city living, blistered quickly. She never mentioned the pain. The second day brought visitors. Hoofbeats thundered through the snow. Thatcher grabbed his rifle and peered through the window. Sheriff Clayton rode at the head of 6 mounted men, their faces grim beneath their hat brims. "Thatcher Kane!" Clayton's voice boomed across the clearing. "We know you got her up there." Eliza appeared at his shoulder. Her face paled as she recognized the hostility in their posture. "What do they want?" "You." Thatcher's mind raced. In 15 years, no lawman had bothered climbing to his cabin. Now, 6 armed men sat their horses in his yard, hungry for trouble. "Open up, Kane. We're looking for a runaway. Colored woman, stole from her employer." Eliza sucked in a sharp breath. "I never stole anything." Thatcher studied her face. Truth lived in her eyes, mixed with old fear. Someone had hurt her badly enough to send her fleeing across half the continent. "She's been accused," Clayton shouted. "Thomas Kane wants his property back." Property. The word hit Thatcher like a fist. He had heard that tone before in courtrooms and back alleys, the casual dehumanization that turned people into things. "What's it going to be?" Eliza whispered. Thatcher looked at her standing straight-backed, despite her fear. At the books she had carefully replaced on his shelves, at the way she had helped him without complaint or expectation. He opened the door. "Sheriff?" Clayton's eyes widened in surprise. The legendary mountain hermit looked surprisingly normal, clean, articulate, sane. "Didn't expect to see you talking to folks, Kane. Heard you went wild up here. Rumors tend to grow in small towns. We're tracking a fugitive. Runaway bound for Thomas Kane. You seen anything? Thatcher's legal training kicked in. Never volunteer information. Never lie outright. Control the narrative. Define fugitive. Colored woman, tall, well-dressed, probably scared. I hired help 3 days ago. Woman needed work. Storm hit before she could head back to town. The lie came smoothly. Thatcher felt something unlock in his chest. Some part of himself he had buried with Sarah. The part that fought for justice. Clayton's eyes narrowed. Help doing what? Cooking. Cleaning. Tasks that need doing. We'll need to question her. She's working. This ain't a request, Kane. Thatcher stepped fully onto his porch. 15 years of physical labor had kept him strong. The rifle in his hands carried easy authority. My property, my employee. You want to talk to her? You talk to me first. The standoff stretched taut. Clayton clearly had not expected resistance from the broken hermit of local legend. Behind Thatcher, Eliza remained silent. But he could feel her presence like warmth against his back. Thomas Kane has legal papers, Clayton said finally. Thomas Kane can present them to a territorial judge. Until then, my hired help stays hired. Clayton spat into the snow. This ain't over. Didn't expect it would be. The sheriff wheeled his horse and led his men back down the mountain. Thatcher watched until they disappeared into the white landscape. Why? Eliza asked from the doorway. Thatcher looked at her, really looked, saw the intelligence in her dark eyes, the strength in the set of her shoulders, the quiet dignity she wore like armor. Because it was right. That evening she cooked him the first real meal he had eaten in years. They sat across from each other at his small table, the silence comfortable now instead of strained. I was a lawyer, he said suddenly. Before. I worked for lawyers in Boston. Before. What happened there? Someone needed a scapegoat. I was convenient. Thatcher nodded. He understood about scapegoats, about blame and guilt and the weight of things beyond control. The woman you lost, Eliza said gently. Your wife. Sarah. We were coming back from town. Wagon wheel caught wrong. She was carrying our first child. I'm sorry. I was driving. The words hung between them like a confession. For 15 years he had carried that guilt alone. Now it felt lighter somehow, shared with someone who understood running from the past. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin. But inside, by the warmth of the fire, two damaged souls sat in companionable silence. Neither mentioned that the storm was supposed to end tomorrow. Neither wanted it to. The storm cleared on the 4th day, leaving the world crystalline and sharp. Thatcher stood in his doorway, breathing air so clean it burned his lungs. For the first time in 15 years he dreaded solitude. Eliza packed her few belongings with quiet efficiency. Neither spoke of their shared meals or evening conversations by the fire. Neither mentioned how natural it felt to move around each other in the small space. The hired help story, she said finally. You'll need to maintain it if I stay in the area. You're staying? Where else would I go? I have no money for another stage ticket. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by terror. Maintaining the deception meant trips to town, interaction with people, breaking 15 years of protective isolation. I'll need supplies anyway, he said. The ride down the mountain felt like descending into another world. Cedar Ridge buzzed with activity that seemed alien after years of silence. Thatcher tied his horse outside the general store and felt every eye on the street tracking his movement. Old Pete Morrison dropped his jaw. Well, I'll be hanged. Thatcher Kane in the flesh. Pete. Heard you was dead, or crazy, or both. Still breathing. Inside the store, conversations died as Thatcher moved between the shelves. He selected flour, beans, coffee, basic supplies that would support 2 people instead of 1. That's a lot of food for a hermit, observed Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife. Hired some help. The word spread through the store like wildfire. By evening, half the town knew the mountain man had come back to civilization. By morning, everyone would know why. Eliza waited in the cabin, her marriage contract spread across his table. She had been studying it with the focused attention of someone trained in legal documents. "Something's wrong with these papers," she said without looking up. Thatcher examined the contract over her shoulder. His legal training, rusty but intact, immediately spotted the irregularities. "The witnessing signatures are identical. Same hand, different names. And look at this clause about debt transfer. If I fail to fulfill the marriage contract, I owe compensation equal to my travel expenses plus penalties. Indentured servitude. Exactly. But here's the strange part. Thomas Kane's signature doesn't match the letter he sent me." Thatcher studied both documents. 2 different people signed these, which means Thomas Kane didn't write the original correspondence. Someone else is running this operation. A knock at the door interrupted their analysis. Doc Ida Walker stood on the porch. Her weathered face creased with concern. She was Cedar Ridge's unofficial healer, the only person who treated everyone regardless of their ability to pay or the color of their skin. "Heard you got company up here, Thatcher." Doc Ida. She stepped inside without invitation and fixed her sharp eyes on Eliza. "Child, you in some kind of trouble? Nothing I can't handle?" "Mm-hmm. That's what they all say." Ida settled into a chair. "Been hearing stories down in town about runaway brides and stolen money and all manner of nonsense." "Just hired help," Thatcher said. "Course she is. And I'm the Queen of England." Ida's eyes twinkled. "But I didn't come here to pry. Came to warn you. Thomas Kane's been stirring up trouble, talking about his rights and his property and how the law needs to step in." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that gets people hurt. Sheriff Clayton's been real interested in his complaints." Eliza and Thatcher exchanged glances. Clayton's hostility during the mountain visit made more sense now. "There's something else," Ida continued. "Thomas Kane ain't the first man in this territory to order himself a wife through the mail. Been a regular stream of them over the past 2 years." "How many?" "Dozen, maybe more, all through the same service. All the women young and desperate and far from home. What happened to them? Most disappeared after a few months. Moved on, folks assumed. But I got to wondering. Young women with nowhere to go, no family to check on them. Makes a person vulnerable." The implications hung heavy in the cabin air. Thatcher felt his old prosecutor instincts stirring. The hunger for justice that had driven him before grief consumed his purpose. "You think it's organized?" "I think there's folks in this territory making money off of misery. And I think your young lady here stumbled into something bigger than a simple mail-order marriage." That night, Eliza helped Thatcher organize his late wife's papers. Sarah had been a teacher too, and her careful lesson plans and student records revealed a methodical mind that matched his own. "She would have liked you," Thatcher said quietly. "How do you know?" "She believed in fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, like you did for me with Sheriff Clayton. You fought for me. We fought for each other." The simple truth of it settled between them like a bridge across 15 years of isolation. Outside, coyotes called across the valley, their voices wild and free. Inside the cabin, 2 people who had lost everything began to discover what they might build together. "Tomorrow I go back to town," Thatcher said. "Ask more questions." "We go back to town." "Too dangerous." "More dangerous if you go alone. I know what to look for in legal documents. You know how to ask questions without arousing suspicion." Partnership. Partnership. Thatcher looked at the woman who had arrived by mistake and changed everything. Smart, brave, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with character. For the first time in 15 years, he looked forward to tomorrow. Doc Ida returned 3 days later with a stranger. The man wore a federal marshal's badge and carried himself with quiet authority. Marshal Frank Davies looked like someone who had seen too much of the world's ugliness to be surprised by anything. "Been investigating complaints about irregular mail-order operations in this territory," Davies said without preamble. "Your situation fits a pattern we've been tracking." Eliza spread her contract on the table alongside 2 others Davies produced from his saddlebags. The similarities were unmistakable. Same witnessing signatures on all 3 documents, Thatcher observed. Same debt clauses, Eliza added. Same impossible penalty structure. Davies nodded grimly. We've documented 17 cases across 4 territories. Women arrive expecting marriage, find themselves trapped in debt slavery instead. What happened to the other women? Some escaped, some didn't. We're still looking for 6 who've gone missing entirely. The weight of that statement settled over the cabin like a shroud. Eliza's hands trembled slightly as she traced her finger along her contract's forged signature. Thomas Kane's not running this alone, Davies continued. Operation this size needs local law enforcement to look the other way, needs official paperwork processed without questions. Sheriff Clayton, Thatcher said. That's our working theory. Been building a case for 8 months, but we needed someone on the inside, someone the targets would trust. You want me to go back to Thomas Kane? Not exactly. We want you to pretend to comply while we gather evidence. Make him think he's winning while we document everything. Thatcher stood abruptly. Absolutely not. I won't put her in danger. I can handle myself, Eliza said quietly. Against men who make women disappear? Against men who underestimate educated women? Thomas Kane thinks he owns me. That makes him careless. Davies pulled out a small leather pouch. Federal marshals have resources, safe houses, protection, but we need evidence that will stand up in territorial court. What kind of evidence? Financial records, correspondence, proof of Sheriff Clayton's involvement, the kind of documents only someone with legal training could properly identify and preserve. Thatcher realized Davies was looking at him. You know about my background. Former territorial prosecutor, retired after personal tragedy. Perfect cover for someone helping us investigate corruption in the justice system. And if something goes wrong, then 17 women and counting never get justice, and the operation expands to new territories. Eliza stood and moved to the window. Below them, Cedar Ridge looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, a town going about its ordinary business while evil flourished in its shadows. I have to try, she said finally. Not just for me, for the others. That evening, they planned the operation with military precision. Eliza would return to Thomas Kane, claiming she had been lost in the storm and seeking shelter. Thatcher would resume his role as mountain hermit, but with regular trips to town to gather intelligence. He'll be suspicious, Eliza warned. Thomas Kane didn't get this far by trusting people. Let him be suspicious. Suspicious people make mistakes. Doc Ida would serve as their communication link, carrying messages between the cabin and town under the guise of her medical rounds. Marshal Davies would remain hidden at her house, coordinating with federal resources. One more thing, Davies said as he prepared to leave. We have reason to believe the operation is preparing to move. Too much attention, too many questions. If Thomas Kane decides to cut his losses, the women become liabilities. How long do we have? Weeks, maybe less. After Davies left, Thatcher and Eliza sat by the fire, both lost in thought. The comfortable silence they had built over the past days now felt charged with tension. I never wanted to care about someone again, Thatcher said suddenly. I know. Sarah died because I made a mistake, lost control of the wagon on a turn I'd taken 100 times. That wasn't your fault. Felt like it for 15 years. He looked at her across the flickering flames. Now I'm terrified I'll make another mistake and lose you too. You won't lose me. We're partners, remember? Partners. The word carried different weight now than it had days before. Partnership had grown into something deeper, something that neither of them dared name but both recognized. When this is over, Eliza said carefully, what happens then? I don't know. What do you want to happen? I want to stay. Here, on this mountain, with you. I want to help you teach again. I want to build something good. Thatcher's chest tightened with hope and fear in equal measure. And if Thomas Kane wins? If the operation disappears and takes you with it? Then you'll find me. I know you will. How can you be so certain? Because you're not the broken man who ran to this mountain 15 years ago. You're the man who stood up to armed riders to protect a stranger. You're the man who chose justice over safety. Outside, night settled over the valley. Tomorrow would bring danger and deception and the constant threat of discovery. But tonight, two people who had found each other by accident held fast to the hope that love might triumph over fear. "Promise me something," Thatcher said. "Anything. Promise me you'll come back to this mountain. Whatever happens, find your way back to me." "I promise." The fire burned low as they made their final preparations. By dawn, Eliza would return to town and the waiting trap. Thatcher would resume his careful isolation, watching from a distance as the woman he loved walked into danger. Neither slept much that night. Both knew too much about how quickly everything could change. Eliza walked into Thomas Kane's general store with her head held high and her marriage contract clutched in her gloved hand. The man behind the counter looked nothing like she had expected. Short, soft around the middle, with calculating eyes that assessed her like livestock. "So you finally decided to honor your obligations." "I was lost in the storm, took shelter with a mountain man until the roads cleared." Thomas Kane's face darkened. "What mountain man?" "Thatcher something. Strange fellow. Lives alone in a cabin." "You stayed with Thatcher Kane for a week?" "He barely spoke to me. Just gave me a corner by the fire and left me alone." Thomas relaxed slightly, but suspicion lingered in his expression. "Well, you're here now. We have business to discuss." He led her to a back room filled with ledgers and filing cabinets. Eliza's trained eye immediately noted the organization. Multiple sets of books, correspondence files sorted by territory. This was no small-time operation. "Your contract includes certain provisions," Thomas said, settling behind his desk. "Penalty clauses for delayed arrival." "I couldn't control the weather." "Nevertheless, you now owe additional fees, room and board during your delay, administrative costs." Eliza pretended to study the figures he presented. In reality, she was memorizing every detail of the room's contents. Marshal Davies had trained her to notice what mattered. "These numbers seem excessive." "That's the contract you signed. Unless you prefer to work off the debt through other arrangements." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Eliza forced herself to appear frightened rather than disgusted. "What kind of arrangements?" "I have business associates who need domestic help. Temporary positions until your debt is satisfied." "How temporary?" "Depends on how cooperative you are." Over the following days, Thomas allowed her limited freedom while keeping her under constant supervision. She swept his store, organized his stock, and listened carefully to every conversation. The pattern became clear quickly. Thomas Kane was the local coordinator for a territory-wide operation. Women arrived expecting marriage and found themselves trapped by fraudulent contracts. Those who resisted disappeared to work opportunities that Marshal Davies had described as slavery in all but name. Sheriff Clayton visited the store twice during her first week. Both times he and Thomas spoke in hushed tones about merchandise shipments and transport arrangements. Both times, Eliza made herself invisible while memorizing every word. "The federal interest is getting stronger," Clayton said during his second visit. "Might be time to clean house." "How clean?" "Clean enough that nobody can testify about anything." Eliza's blood turned to ice. Clean house meant eliminating witnesses, women who knew too much about the operation. That evening, she managed to slip a message to Doc Ida during the older woman's visit to treat Thomas's persistent cough. 3 words written on a scrap of paper and pressed into Ida's palm during a handshake. "Moving soon. Hurry." Doc Ida's eyes flickered with understanding, but her expression never changed. "Take care of that cough, Mr. Kane. Mountain air can be hard on the lungs." 2 days later, everything accelerated. Thatcher appeared in town with a wagon and the story that he needed supplies for an extended winter. His presence drew curious stares, but no suspicion. Who would imagine the legendary hermit was coordinating with federal marshals? He shopped methodically, visiting every business on the main street. To casual observers, he was simply a man unused to civilization, taking his time with unfamiliar social interactions. In reality, he was positioning himself for what Marshall Davies called the evidence-gathering phase. "Tonight," he murmured to Eliza as she helped load his supplies. "Be ready." That evening, Thomas Kane made his fatal mistake. He gathered all his records in preparation for destroying them. Ledgers full of names, dates, financial transactions, correspondence that detailed the entire criminal network. He also gathered the women. 4 others besides Eliza, all trapped by similar fraudulent contracts, all scheduled for transport to new opportunities in the morning, all terrified but trying to hide it. "Pack light," Thomas instructed. "You won't need much where you're going." At midnight, Marshall Davies struck. Federal agents surrounded the building while Thatcher and Eliza secured the evidence. Years of legal training served them both well as they rapidly sorted through documents, identifying what would stand up in territorial court. "Financial records here," Eliza called softly, cross-referenced by victim name and territory. "Correspondence with law enforcement," Thatcher added, including payment schedules for Sheriff Clayton. Thomas Kane tried to run but found federal marshals blocking every exit. Sheriff Clayton arrived with backup, thinking he was responding to a routine disturbance, only to find federal weapons pointed at his chest. "Clayton Matthews," Marshall Davies announced formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, human trafficking, and violation of federal interstate commerce laws." The sheriff's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about. We have documented evidence of bribes paid for your cooperation in this operation, your signature on falsified legal documents, testimony from multiple witnesses." Thomas Kane's arrest followed swiftly. Faced with federal charges and overwhelming evidence, he broke within hours, providing names and locations of the broader criminal network. By dawn, 17 women had been freed from various forms of bondage across 4 territories. 6 missing women were located alive, though traumatized. The entire operation collapsed as federal agents arrested conspirators from Utah to California. Eliza stood in Thomas Kane's store as the sun rose, watching federal agents catalog evidence. Her fake marriage contract lay in pieces on the floor, no longer a chain but merely paper. "It's over," Thatcher said quietly beside her. "Is it?" "The legal part is. Thomas Kane will spend decades in federal prison. So will Clayton and the others." "And us?" Thatcher looked at the woman who had transformed his world through courage and intelligence. "That's just beginning." 6 months later, Thatcher stood before a classroom for the first time in 15 years. 23 children of various ages filled the wooden benches, their faces bright with curiosity. The new Cedar Ridge schoolhouse smelled of fresh pine and chalk dust. "Today we're going to learn about the Constitution," he announced, his voice steady and strong. Behind him, Eliza arranged books on shelves that lined the walls. The library had been her idea, funded by federal reward money from the trafficking case. Every child in Cedar Ridge now had access to literature, mathematics, and history, regardless of their family's circumstances. "Mr. Kane?" asked Sally Morrison, old Pete's granddaughter. "Is it true you lived alone on the mountain for 15 years?" "It is." "Why did you come back?" Thatcher glanced at Eliza, who smiled encouragingly from beside the bookshelf. "Because sometimes helping others helps us heal ourselves." The answer satisfied the children, who returned their attention to their lessons. But the truth was more complex and more beautiful than any simple explanation could capture. After school, Thatcher and Eliza walked home together along the mountain path. The cabin had changed over the months. Eliza's presence had transformed it from a hermit's retreat into a genuine home. Curtains brightened the windows. Books lay open on tables. The scent of evening meals replaced the perpetual silence of solitude. "Doc Ida stopped by while you were teaching," Eliza said as they climbed the familiar trail. "She has news from Marshall Davies." "Good news or bad news?" "Good. The last of the trafficking network was arrested in California. 43 women freed total." "And the missing ones?" "All found alive. Some choosing to start new lives. others returning to families they thought they'd never see again. They reached the cabin as the sun touched the western peaks. The view from their porch stretched across the valley to Cedar Ridge below, where lamplight flickered in windows and smoke rose from chimneys. "I used to think this mountain was a prison," Thatcher said, settling into his chair beside her. "What do you think it is now?" "Home." The simple word carried weight earned through months of shared struggle and mutual discovery. They had built something together that honored both their pasts and their hopes for the future. Eliza opened the letter that had arrived with the morning stage. "The territorial governor wants to meet with us next month. Something about establishing literacy programs in other communities. Interested?" "Are you?" Thatcher considered the possibility of expanding their work beyond Cedar Ridge. 6 months ago, the thought of leaving his mountain would have terrified him. Now it represented opportunity to help others as they had been helped. "We could make a difference." "We already are making a difference." She was right. Their school served children who had never had consistent education before. The library provided resources to families scattered across the remote territory. Other communities had begun requesting assistance in establishing similar programs. "Sarah would have loved this," Thatcher said quietly. "Tell me about her." It had taken months for him to speak easily about his first wife, but Eliza's patient understanding had gradually healed that old wound. Sarah's memory no longer brought crushing guilt, but gentle gratitude for love shared, however briefly. She believed education could change the world, one student at a time. She was right. She would have liked you. You both see possibility where others see problems. Eliza reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. The simple contact still sent warmth through him, still amazed him with its reality. "I never expected to be this happy," she admitted. "Neither did I." They had married 3 months earlier in a simple ceremony performed by Doc Ida, who had been ordained years before to serve her scattered community. No contracts or legal obligations had bound them together, only choice, freely made and daily renewed. Inside the cabin, Eliza prepared dinner while Thatcher reviewed the next day's lessons. The domestic routine felt natural now, though he still occasionally marveled at the sound of another person moving through his space. "The Harrison boy is struggling with mathematics," he observed. "His father lost work when Thomas Kane's store closed. Family's under pressure. Maybe we could arrange some tutoring, extra help after regular hours. I could teach his sister to read while you work with him on numbers." This was how they operated now. Partnership in everything, from daily decisions to long-term planning. 2 minds working together toward common goals, each contributing different strengths to shared challenges. After dinner, they sat by the fire as had become their habit. Eliza worked on correspondence with other communities seeking educational assistance. Thatcher wrote in the journal that had become both personal record and professional reflection on their teaching methods. "Any regrets?" she asked suddenly. "About what?" "Leaving Boston, coming west, ending up trapped in a trafficking scheme that brought you to this mountain." Thatcher set down his pen and looked at her. Firelight played across her face, highlighting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the quiet strength that had first attracted him. "That trafficking scheme brought me the best thing that ever happened to me. Even better than your first marriage? Different. Sarah and I were young and thought we had forever. You and I know how precious time is, how quickly everything can change. So we don't waste it. We don't waste it." Outside their windows, stars appeared one by one in the mountain darkness. Inside, 2 people who had found each other through mistake and circumstance continued building a life based on choice and love. 15 years of silence had taught Thatcher to listen. Now he finally had something worth saying.